One of the foremost things on my mind was how their demeanor just did not seem appropriate for the situation at hand. The first one I took a look at was from March 18th, conducted by YouTube creator Chronicles of Olivia, in which Kris and Katie were similarly unemotional, but it wasn't just that. When Katie would speak, she would typically look straight ahead, around, sometimes behind the camera at Olivia, but almost never at her husband. And throughout the entire interview, she just seems kind of emotionless. Kris, on the other hand, would speak looking directly into the camera, while almost never looking at Olivia or even his own wife. And when he would express emotion, it was the wrong one. He would laugh, he would smile, he would seem almost giddy on certain occasions. And like I said, Kris and Katie almost never look at each other throughout this entire conversation, but when they do, it's just on a few occasions when someone's answering a question. And it's weird because they answer a lot of questions without looking at each other. It's just these 3 specific times. Like in one case, while answering a question about the events of Sunday the 25th before Sebastian disappeared, she paused, looked at Kris, and then says, we went and picked up our niece. Yeah, I got a call and asked if I could go and pick her up, and I did, and so we went and did that. Unfortunately, there wasn't much that I could compare the physical aspects of this interview to, because even when they had the ability to use video when calling into a show, they chose not to in most interviews. That said, there were still other videos of them, and while I had been under the impression that Olivia's interview on March 18th was the first one the Proudfoots had done, I was alerted to an earlier one by the Sebastian Rogers subreddit, one conducted by WSMV News on the 5th of March. Where the Proudfoots had largely appeared emotionless during their interviews with Nancy Grace and Chronicles of Olivia, in this one for the news, Katie at least looked much more the part of the scared mother that you would expect to see. Her voice trembles and she noticeably rocks back and forth as she speaks about the incident. And this is something that I then went back to look for in other videos. And I found that in the Nancy Grace interview, the angle that she's sitting at makes it a little too hard to tell if she's moving back and forth. But in terms of overall movement, Katie remains extremely still in that interview, like very still. In the Chronicles of Olivia one, however, I did catch a gentle yet perceptible rocking motion on a few occasions. But that WSMV News video is very heavily edited, and the Proudfoots are really only shown on screen for a little over a minute, so you can't get much from it. Now, I'm not a behavioral expert, and the most I can say is that I've gone and watched behavioral experts talk about these interviews, but I have not gone through enough analysis yet, so I'll get to those in the part 3 of this series. But what I will say is that it wasn't just the demeanor. In addition to that somewhat strange demeanor displayed in these videos, some of the things that Katie said about the day before Sebastian disappeared struck me as odd, and in some cases, things were inconsistent between appearances. The first instance that caught my attention was the way in which Katie Proudfoot described the events of the morning before Sebastian went missing. And this was beginning around 58 seconds into that interview with Chronicles of Olivia. Katie tells Olivia, "We got up and, fun fact, I made breakfast that morning. We had a good time, we were laughing, we were joking, and he talked to the family on the phone during breakfast to brag." Aside from the choice of words being a little strange, it struck me as odd that she included that little detail about her making breakfast. If it were just her and Sebastian in the house, and at no point has she ever talked about Sebastian liking to cook, who else would have made breakfast that morning? Details such as this can be evidence of a fabrication, though not always, as somebody with a keen eye for detail is likely going to give those kinds of responses. Someone who gives a very specific detail amongst a sea of vague answers, however, should be viewed with a little bit of suspicion. The other strange part was her saying that Sebastian had called his family members to brag, as if that was just something kids normally do on a Sunday morning. And even if it were something that kids normally do on a Sunday morning, which in my experience it wasn't, what was he bragging about? And while that comment about bragging didn't appear in the WSMV or Nancy Grace interviews, it did appear in a March 17th interview hosted by a YouTube creator called Duchess and her panel. In that appearance, Katie said much the same thing that she had said to Olivia, telling the panel, "Sunday morning we got up and I made a fun breakfast for us. Spaghetti pancakes. Google it, y'all." Once again, just weird phrasing under the circumstances, and also who tells somebody to Google a recipe while talking about their missing son? I mean, at this point, Sebastian had been missing for a solid 3 weeks, and there were no leads. And she's talking about spaghetti pancakes and bragging about how she made breakfast. In any case, she continued, saying, "We FaceTime family while we were eating so he could brag, because that's something he likes to do, and we were laughing and joking on FaceTime and having a good time." I do want to say, I understand that Sebastian is on the spectrum, and maybe this calling family to brag thing is something that he likes to do, but in multiple interviews, Chris Proudfoot said that his son was kind of struggled speaking to adults, even family members. But after this, she said, "We got a call to go and pick up our niece," which matches what she told Olivia in the interview that was released the day following this. I will admit that the phrasing here of who was being called, who was going to pick up the niece, whose niece it was, and who all was actually there along for the ride that day did send me down a rabbit hole trying to figure out, if there were any inconsistencies here, but it ultimately led nowhere. At least not in relation to the niece. But as I sifted through more and more interviews, I came across further inconsistencies in the narrative given by the Proudfoots. One of these was with regard to what happened between 9 p.m. when Katie told Sebastian to go to bed and midnight when Katie herself went to bed. According to the first version of the story given by Katie in the interviews from March 3rd, 5th, and 17th, she sent Sebastian to bed at 9 p.m. and that was the end of it. Other interviews, however, add a detail. In the interview on the 18th, Katie said, "He was doing something in his room because about an hour later I heard some noise and I was like, I don't care what you're doing in there, but go to sleep." It's not proof of anything that this only appears on the 18th, but I do wonder why she would not include that detail in previous conversations. And that Chronicles of Olivia interview is much shorter and much less in-depth than either of the ones with Duchess, so I'm curious why it is that she gave 3 interviews not mentioning any hearing a sound at, 10 p.m., and then suddenly she remembers it. And in another interview on the 20th, this time with the YouTube creator Smiley Stories World, she reiterated that statement with only a minor change to the verbiage. Instead of "go to sleep," it was "you're supposed to go to sleep," which would be absolutely no problem if not for the interview with Nancy Grace 5 days later. You see, Nancy asked specifically about what Katie described to her as a thud heard around 10 p.m., saying, you said, "Look, I don't care what you're doing in there, go to bed, is that right?" And this time, Katie said that her exact words were, "Bubba, did you fall out of the bed?" And he said, "No, ma'am." And I said, "Well, whatever you're doing in there, knock it off and go to sleep." While I'm not going to say that this is what happened, it does almost seem like the story told by the Proudfoots changes as public opinion shifts. Initially, he just went to bed around 9, but then we have this additional detail about a thud heard around 10 p.m. And the thing is, people did not react well in the chats and the comments section to the fact that after hearing this thud from her autistic son, Katie did not go check on the boy. So then they go on Crime Stories on the 25th, and this time it's not just that she heard a thud, and it's not just that she said, keep it quiet. It's also that she asked if he was okay first, and that he responded to her. So she wouldn't need to check on him because he was okay. I will say, in another interview, the excuse that she gave for not going to check on him at all that night is that he was a teenage boy and, you don't want to accidentally walk in on anything, as if knocking on a door is not an option. That said, in her defense, my little brother is on the spectrum in what appears to me to be at least a similar way to Sebastian, and I was asking my dad about it, and he did tell me that if he heard a thud from Liam's room, he wasn't going to think anything of it. So like I said, it's possible that her story was shifting with public opinion, but I also think that maybe public opinion was harping on the wrong thing there, because again, Sebastian's 15, he's not gonna hurt himself falling off a bed probably. But in any case, this was not the only thing that changed between those early interviews and the Nancy Grace appearance. Because the nature of what Katie was actually up to in those 3 hours before Sebastian went to bed and she went to bed is pretty unclear. In the interview from the 3rd, Duchess, speaking to Katie, said, "You fell asleep on the couch about 10 o'clock, but you said that Sebastian went to bed at 9 p.m. And then you got up off the couch and you went to bed, and you said that was around midnight." And rather than allowing Katie to answer the question that she had just been directly asked, Chris cut in to explain what happened. And he began by saying, "There's actually a piece of, so to make something very crystal clear, so that way there's transparency across the board, me and the mom were on the phone at 9:43 or 9:46 in the evening. We stayed on the phone for quite some time." And this was followed by the unprompted information that the call logs have been verified by all the police departments, TBI included, even though it appears nobody had asked. So far as I can tell, this is the first time that anybody had told this part of the story to the media, So I just don't understand the need for a disclaimer there, as if it was a question that he had been asked on other interviews. But he continued, saying, "We stayed on the phone. It was very lengthy. Mom did slightly start falling asleep while she was on the couch. I said, 'Hey, you need to wake up, put the dogs up.' And finally, Chris said, 'Now mind you, that was right around midnight, just before midnight or right around midnight.'" So in this version, Katie got on the phone around 9:45 p.m. and then began to nod off around midnight. In the March 17th interview, the story is much the same, with Duchess asking Katie to walk me through exactly what transpired during that time before you went to bed at midnight. And again, I want to emphasize was walk me through exactly what transpired, okay? Because this is important. Katie told the panel that she and Chris usually talked at night and that Katie frequently started to fall asleep before they had hung up. And Chris would tell her, "Wake up, you got to go to bed," in this case around midnight. From there, she says she got up and put the puppies up before turning in for the night. And then the next time I could find this period being discussed was during that Nancy Grace interview on the 25th, in which Nancy asked Katie what she was doing between 9 p.m. and midnight. And this time, Katie replied, "I had been reading a chapter that I needed to, and I had been talking to my husband on the phone." And this was a detail that she had not mentioned prior. And as I said, Duchess asked her to describe exactly what transpired. So where did this detail come from, and why was it not present a week earlier? But Katie elaborated, "I was falling asleep on him, so that's when he told me it was around midnight. He told me to go ahead and put the dogs up and go to bed, and that's what I did." Later in that same interview, Nancy would ask her to clarify what she was reading a chapter for. She said for school, but what? And she said that it was for a business administration course at DeVry. And along with the evolving details of that night, another thing that caught my eye was that phrasing of "put the dogs up." It's weird because in that interview with Duchess and her panel from the 17th, Katie had told the panel that when Sebastian gets up to get snacks in the middle of the night, the dogs don't bark at him because he shushes them. So what is meant by "put the dogs up"? In order for him to shush them, he would have to walk past them. And according to Chris and Katie Proudfoot, in every interview where they discussed it, Sebastian's room was on the ground floor because they live in a ranch-style home that has a bonus room above the garage. And again, the reason that this is a problem is because in all of the interviews where the Proudfoots talk about the layout of the home, they tell everybody that Sebastian's room is on the south side of the home, and that the bonus room over the garage, well, that would be on the north side of the home. So if the dogs were being put up, that would imply that they were being put up in the bonus room. But Sebastian doesn't pass the bonus room to get to the kitchen. So what's meant by "put the dogs up"? I'll be honest, this could be a total nothing burger. It was just she kept saying it every single time. It's one of the only consistent things she says in these interviews, and it makes no sense given the layout of the house as they've described it. They say that Sebastian has to walk past the dogs to get to the kitchen, but they also say "put the dogs up." I know I'm repeating myself here. It's weird. Of course, none of this is really a smoking gun, but it is, in my opinion, enough to question the reliability of the stories being told, especially if other factors of the situation are considered, such as the manner in which Chris conducted himself during interviews. Throughout the appearances made by the Proudfoots, one thing I noticed is that Chris very much seemed to be in control of the narrative they presented, and he was the one fielding most of the questions. But then upon closer inspection, I noticed that he also frequently avoided answering questions. He would say something that would sound almost like an answer, but it would avoid the substance of what he was being asked. Now, Katie, it seems, did this too, but there was really only one instance that stuck out to me, and that was from the March 17th interview. I believe it was Duchess, but it might have been another member of the panel, who asked, "How many pairs of shoes does Sebastian have?" Katie answered, saying, "I'm not going to tell you how many shoes he has, but I will say that all the shoes he has are accounted for." Beyond hiding some form of severe neglect, I cannot fathom a reason to completely withhold this information. While I could understand not giving an exact number, because any deviation from that given number could engender suspicion from the internet, I don't understand not at least giving an estimation, like, oh, he's got about half a dozen pairs, he has about 4 pairs, he has about a dozen pairs. But then, after one of the panelists, named Crystal, said that she didn't quite hear Katie, Chris clarified that she said she would not divulge how many pairs of shoes she has, but law enforcement has accounted for every pair of shoes. And Katie then, without prompting or missing a beat, followed that up with what to me sounds like a correction, when she said, "I have accounted for all of his shoes." Now, personally, I feel like the panel probably should have followed up on that, but they didn't, and Katie once again claimed that all of his shoes are still accounted for inside the house still during their appearance with Nancy Grace. Now, during that interview, as well as several others, Chris avoided, refused, or simply failed to answer numerous questions, and in some cases for reasons that I just find utterly bizarre. The first one I want to address came when Nancy was asking about the make, model, and year of the cars driven by the couple, and Katie answered that she drove a 2017 Infiniti SUV. Chris, on the other hand, simply said that he drove a diesel truck, specifically a Chevy, and did not give a year. So Nancy followed up and said, well, what was the year? And Chris said he didn't know off the top of his head, but he thought it was probably a 2021 model. Now, this wouldn't always strike me as odd, but in this case, Chris had given several extremely specific answers earlier in this very interview, as well as in an early interview from March 3rd, again with Duchess. Now recall, in that March 3rd interview with Duchess, he was able to tell her 2 very specific times that he may have gotten onto the phone with his wife, 9:43 and 9:46 p.m. And you know, most people, under those circumstances, would say around 9:45. And then earlier in that Crime Stories interview, he had told Nancy Grace that the time from his doorstep to his job site in Memphis was exactly 3 hours and 37 minutes. You know, leaving aside the fact that travel times are almost never consistent down to the minute across distances such as the 229 miles between Stafford Court and St. Jude's in Memphis, it's pretty hard for me to believe that. One big reason for that is that Chris works in construction, which means that the specifications for his work vehicle are going to be extremely important to him. When purchasing a truck, he probably compared different brands and different model years and specifically chose 2021, especially considering that it seems like he's not struggling with money. That's also something I'm going to get to in part 3 because I have no idea where all of this man's money is coming from. And in addition to that bit, while anecdotal, I can't think of a single person I know who could not tell you the year of their primary vehicle. Aiden, what year's your truck?
1989.
What year's your Camaro?
2010.
Amanda, what year is my Altima?
2020.
What year is my Jeep?
2014.
I think I make my point. I think Chris knows what year his car was made. In the interview, Nancy didn't say anything that would suggest she caught this and kind of had the same thought, but the look on her face definitely suggested that. So she carried on to confirm where the cars were that night.